The flu season is in full swing, so go ahead, take some absolute sips of that NyQuil, get a little bit tipsy on that cough syrup, wipe those disgusting boogers on your forearm, go ahead and cuddle with your Pokemon body pillows, you weirdos. We have another fantastic list for you guys. We're going to be looking at the top 5 Spider-Man suits, and this is coming obviously from a fan's perspective. I don't know the functionality of each suit. I don't know which one will ride up in your butt crack. I don't know which one causes like nipple chafing for Peter Parker. So I'm literally just basing this off of what my favorite styles are, favorite colors, favorite color schemes, things of that nature. So without further ado, without any more saliva and oxygen being wasted, let's jump straight into number 5. We obviously had a sneak Bagman in here. I'm totally joking. We're not going to even try to squeeze that awful suit into this particular list. The real number 5, we're going to go with none other than the Spider-Man Noir outfit. Now, this particular spot doesn't necessarily belong to a specific suit. It's more of an alternate version of Peter Parker from the universe or the alternate Earth known as 90214. Even though we have had multiple iterations of this particular suit, we had one in the Gamerverse not too long ago, and then obviously the animated series or the animated film version as well, which was voiced by Nicolas Cage. However, his first appearance in the comic books was with his own comic book titled Spider-Man Noir all the way back in 2008. Even though this particular suit is still donned by Peter Parker, this is definitely a darker iteration of Peter Parker. He actually ends up more or less killing the Green Goblin and actually takes out the Vulture right before that. His timeline eventually kind of crosses into the Spider-Verse, or I should say Edge of Spider-Verse little comic book storyline from a few years ago. But I just feel like the costume was a brand new redesign. It was something completely different. Most of the costumes on this particular list are just basically going to be, repaints or different color or different variations of what we're used to from Peter Parker's costume, or, I should say the suit. But in this particular case, it was a completely different revamp. It looked stylish. It looked cool. It was a new design. It was definitely something that we weren't used to. And honestly, I think this could have easily been number 1 if it weren't for the fact that it's a very niche style of costume. It's not for everyone, but I definitely feel like it was unique enough to set itself apart. The next spot on our list actually belongs to the only Spider-Man that can pull off skinny jeans. He looks like the kind of guy that will obliterate his own nutsack while kicking ass. I'm not sure why he chose to do it that way, but it is what it is. We're going to be looking at the SpiderPunk outfit. He made his first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man number 10 all the way back in the 2014 run. Technically, we're kind of smudging the list a little bit here. This isn't technically Peter Parker, but it's still a semi Spider-Man suit. Same thing with this particular costume. It's kind of niche, but I really like the fact that it was not just a redesign, it's a completely new costume, completely new take on Spider-Man. Definitely very outlandish, but it's incredibly creative. This suit actually perfectly represents or encapsulates everything that this particular Spider-Man is all about. He's about, kind of a rebellion, standing up for the middleman, going up against Osborn in this particular universe where he's president. Eventually, we actually see him cross into the Spider-Verse as well. He is chosen by Superior Spider-Man, who at the time obviously is the Spider-Man taken over by Osborn. But as I mentioned before, I think his costume has just stood the test of time and, found really its own audience within the comic book community for sure. For our number 3, we're going to continue to kind of smudge the lines a little bit. This isn't, again, Peter Parker. This is technically Spider-Man, but this is Otto Octavius taking over the Spider-Man role. This happens in Amazing Spider-Man number 697 all the way back in 2012. Marvel comic books actually did something that was incredibly dangerous at the time. They replaced Peter Parker's consciousness with Otto Octavius, so he basically took over the role of Spider-Man for a short period of time. He was brutal, he was relentless, and his ultimate objective was to be a better version of Spider-Man than Peter Parker ever was. The suit in many ways was actually a lot more advanced than anything that Peter Parker had created at the time. He actually goes on to defeat at least that version of the Sinister Six, which featured Beetle, Boomerang, Overdrive, Shocker, Living Brain, and Speed Demon. As I mentioned before, Superior Spider-Man is actually a huge part of the Edge of the Spider-Verse whole entire storyline, and he starts to unravel some great mysteries involving the Spider-Verse. The design for his costume, regardless, is just absolutely fantastic. Even though it's mostly just a play on the original colors, it's kind of a darker scheme, but as I mentioned before, it's all about standing out. It's all about standing on its own, and that's exactly what happens with the Superior Spider-Man suit, which again was perfectly designed by Otto Octavius. Our second spot on the list was actually pretty easy. We're going to be looking at the Iron Suit, which had its first appearance all the way back in Amazing Spider-Man 529, way back in 2006. And this is a suit that actually takes place within the Earth 616 universe. And very similar to the MCU, Tony Stark was actually the designer for this particular suit. And this particular timeline was actually known as the Civil War, which even if you've watched the MCU and not really read any real comic books, you're very familiar with this. It was basically ripped out of the pages. There is a little civil war that goes on between a team led by Iron Man and then a team led by Captain America. When this all started, obviously Peter Parker was on the side of Iron Man, which led to the Iron Spider, although he would eventually forfeit the suit because he would eventually switch teams. This was an incredibly dark and I think risky timeline for the Marvel Universe. They were willing to take risks. They were willing to go out on a limb, and this particular suit was obviously used to fight within the entire Marvel superhero community, and I think that's why it carries a little bit more of weight for sure. Aside from the extra arms / legs that could obviously attack and defend him, the suit also had the capability of gliding, as well as being heat resistant and bulletproof. We've obviously recently seen this portrayed in the MCU, but we've also seen it kind of make a little bit of a comeback. We've seen it more in action figure form, and I think it's great to see the suit getting some opportunity to shine in the spotlight because it definitely deserves it. It's an iconic, cool, sleek look, and the fact that this was integrating all of Tony Stark's technology, I think makes this suit only that much better. Our top spot is definitely going to go to probably one of the most iconic costumes of all time. We're going to be looking at the black suit or the symbiote suit, depending on who you ask. We first got to see this in Secret Wars number 8. For those of you guys that aren't too familiar with what Secret Wars is, I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but basically all of the heroes and all of the villains are placed in this big giant biosphere, basically, where they're meant to basically destroy each other. Eventually Galactus basically tries to devour the entire battle world, which is the arena where all of the heroes and villains are battling. But as is the case with Iron Spider, this particular storyline or this little stretch of Marvel Comics is incredibly dark. It's incredibly risky. They took a lot of big leaps here. But out of all that, which is usually the case, came an amazing suit, which, as I mentioned before, it's the black symbiote suit. Now, eventually, as time went by, we started to see the lore kind of build on this. Eventually, we saw this become a symbiote, and then that started to unravel. And as if you guys have, read any of the Absolute Carnage comic book storylines, you guys will be very familiar with what eventually came. We got introduced to, the entire symbiote universe and Null and a lot of other different symbiotes that played a huge role into this, and then eventually we saw Venom take over for as a symbiote king. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I think this particular suit was really ahead of its time, and for those of you guys that aren't really too familiar with it, it was actually an idea that came from Randy Schuler, who was actually just an aspiring comic book creator. Marvel was really digging deep. They really were running dry in terms of ideas, so they decided to kind of give an opportunity to fans to feed them any cool concepts that they had, and this was one of them. He came up with the symbiote suit, a redesign of what we originally were used to when it came down to Spider-Man for decades. The idea was eventually bought off of Schuler for only just a couple of $100, but I personally think that it just goes to show that, great ideas don't necessarily have to come from just comic book creators. Sometimes some fans almost have a better understanding of what the community wants to see, and I think that's a perfect example of that. But there you have it. That's our particular list. I didn't want to drag this out. I didn't want to waste saliva and oxygen just beating around the bush. These are the top 5 Spider-Man suits from the comic book universe, at least in my personal opinion. We might try to make other lists that are a little bit more inclusive. Maybe we try to do a top 5 Spider-Man video game comic books, and then maybe one for the MCU, so stay tuned for that. But as always, I appreciate you guys tuning in, wasting a little bit of time with us. Let us know what your top Spider-Man costume is of all time, or your top 5. I'm very curious, very interested to see what you guys have to say. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.